So I want to give you a brief tour of the description and simulation of internal waves in the coastal ocean. That's kind of the plan. So I'm going to start with some stuff from the field. I'm an interested participant in field work. I obviously am not an expert, so bear with me. So this is what I consider quite a famous picture. I think David Farmer sent it to me when I was a postdoc. It's a kind of a combination picture from Knight Inlet, which is a well-studied fjord in British Columbia. In the upper picture, what you see is a ship, a research ship, and they actually had enough money to have a helicopter associated with this one. So you also see these bands up at the top, right, which are due to the surface manifestations of internal motions, systematic internal motions, and in fact, internal waves. At the bottom, you see kind of a map showing you kind of the geographic setting. So these fjords, right, water level was a lot lower during the Ice Age because all that water was trapped in ice. And then when it all melted, water level went up. So you have kind of these leftovers, right? So they have what's called a glacial sill, which means that away from the sill, the water is, over 200 meters deep. And then at the sill, it's quite shallow, about 50 meters deep. So you have a tidal driving of a stratified fluid, right? Because at the head of the fjord, you've got a nice fresh river pouring in. And so you have quite a strong near surface stratification, which you can see in the kind of the middle left of the figure. And then there's a Doppler picture showing you some internal waves, which some I guess I would consider artists' conceptions of what the currents are. And what you see is that you have these systematic little lumps, right? And it's those lumps that are responsible for the striations that you see near the ship in the top picture. And those are called by a number of different names. I call them internal solitary-like waves, or ISWs, and I'll talk about some of the acronyms in a bit. You see there's a bit of a mess sort of towards around minus 200, minus 300, right? Some kind of breakdowns happening. And then you see a monstrosity over the sill, right? The edge of the sill. I still don't really know what to think about that. There are competing theories for it. And the reason David sent me that picture was to sort of provoke a little bit, because the lab I was in for my postdoc had a different theory than the one him and Larry Army had. So here's another picture. This one I show an awful lot. I have a longstanding interest in the bottom boundary layer and how it's energized and cross-boundary layer transport due to internal solitary waves. And this is, to me, the best picture of this. I'd be happy to be corrected if someone's got a better one. This is a group out of Portugal working with the Portuguese Navy. So this is Quaresma et al. It was in Marine Geology, kind of a strange journal for me. But what you see is you've got kind of a signature of a wave train, right, with the biggest wave out front. So we would call it rank ordered. And then I added these arrows to show you these basically echo or proxies for turbidity, right? So where you've kicked up a bunch of sediment. So it seems like associated with, kind of unambiguously in this case, associated with internal solitary waves, you've got a strong cross-boundary layer transport over 20 meters in this case. Here's a picture from space of the same area, right? So this is one of the ESA satellites, or sorry, ENVISAT. And you can see all these very complicated striations. They did a nice job of kind of drawing them on a map. And the point of this one is that we're going to clean things up a lot. Theorists kind of tend to do that. But the real ocean is fairly complicated. It has multiple wave trains. They're not always propagating directly sort of onshore or offshore. So it's kind of important to, the point of the mathematical theory is to have cartoons, right? And then the point of the brain, as opposed to, a human version of ChatGPT or something, is to exercise some caution in terms of like, okay, well, this isn't going to give me all the answers about the oceans, but it's going to give me some. Okay, so this is a simulation I'm going to show you from work by Kevin Lamb and Alex Warren-Varnas. It's the well-studied South China Sea, one of the most energetic places for internal solitary waves, and place of great political intrigue and all the rest of that stuff. So you have waves generated where my cursor is over here, between Taiwan and the Philippines, and then they kind of propagate in all sorts of directions, but the ones people are generally interested in head sort of towards China, and then they shoal and they interact with this Dongsha Atoll somewhere around here. So Lamb and Warren-Varnas did a really big 2D simulations of this using a finite volume model that I actually worked on during my PhD thesis. And what you see is, well, you can barely see it up here. You have basically what looks like a tiny wave in the deep. and then it goes along and gets into shallower and shallower water. And they did a really nice job resolving things, right? So around 30-meter resolution around on the slope, which is really good. It's a non-hydrostatic model, so it does kind of everything right, except for the bottom boundary layer, and I'll get to that later. Oh, yeah, and it was an NPG a few years ago, so here's the title of the paper. So what happens? Well, the wave kind of gets into shallow water, and at first, not much happens. It changes shape a little bit, right? But then because it kind of keeps getting shallower and shallower, the waveguide changes, right? So if you think about a waveguide, you stretch an elastic, you hit it, it makes these funny little sounds. Everyone probably did that when they were bored in class when they were little kids. And so then just, after you wanted to amuse yourself a little further, maybe you changed how tight the elastic was, and then, that changed the tone that you would make on it. So in the same way, the waveguide here changes as you get into shallower water, and you get basically different kind of waves emerging. So here you end up having two waves coming out of the one that you did before. And basically what's happening, right, is you're changing the depth of these pictures. So these waves aren't really bigger in absolute terms, right? It's just that they're bigger relative to the local depth, okay? So sometimes that's quoted as a nonlinearity parameter. And so you would say these waves are a little more nonlinear than the waves out in the deep. Okay, so that's still not super exciting, but this one is more exciting. So this one, you can see that the leading wave is starting to really steepen up at the back, right? And then if you go further, now you start to think, it's sort of hard to even call these things a wave, right? So if you took a wave theory course, probably you learned almost everything using linear waves. And these waves, in fact, are not linear, right? These end up being nonlinear dispersive waves. And in fact, this is initialized with an exact solution of the stratified Euler equations, which I'll talk about in a bit. But it's definitely something weird by the time it gets to here, right? Nothing like what wave theory would talk about. And then over here, now you start to see what almost looks like tabletops, and a little bit more of that here. So here it is again, somewhat larger, with some takeaways on the left. So in deep water, there appear to be small, gentle humps. Apparently, I'm feeling Shakespearean when I made these slides and said the. Shoaling yields transformation into multiple waves, and some with some pretty exotic shapes. And the thing that to think about is that this transformation is essentially energy conserving, right? So it's inviscid. So you don't need to worry about turbulence. You don't need to worry about bottom boundary layers, right? All of it just kind of happens. And what's really cool about that is if you do a little thought experiment, so imagine you came up into the shallows and then you just reverse the process, right? And you kind of went back out into the deep, you would not return to the same little wave, right? So we tend to think of, because we're usually start by learning linear theory, we tend to think of things as being time. As soon as we take away dissipative processes, we think that things are time reversible. And in fact, these waves are not, right? You would not recover the original wave under any circumstances, which I think is kind of neat. And these sort of theoretical musings will pop up here and there again. Okay, so an example a little closer. I don't much like the South China Sea stuff. I visited Hong Kong on one of my sabbaticals, and some of the politics. It's interesting to hear it from the different sides. So I've never really worked on the South China Sea as much as some of those papers are interesting. So here's one just north of Boston, between Cape Cod and Canada, right? So Nova Scotia would be in the upper right, and there have been waves measured in this area for a long, long time. And you see these different wave fronts. So again, just like Quaresma, I'm going to show you a lot of clean things, but the idea is that tidally generated waves happen all the time in the coastal ocean. Quite often they're nonlinear, and quite often they exist in a fairly busy environment. Here's an example of shoaling from the Gulf of St. Lawrence. This is Daniel Bourgault's work, and basically, again, if you focus on this picture and in the middle over here, right, these waves, when they get to the shallows, they do propagate almost normal to the shore. So even though you do get situations where there's a lot of complexity, sometimes, and of course, WKB theory kind of gives you a sense of why this happens. It's a fairly standard example in wave courses to do it for surface waves, but you are kind of propagating, in a way that the wave crest is parallel to the shore. And so as this happens, right, all sorts of complicated and interesting things occur. And some of these are, in fact, dissipative, right? You get a lot of local turbulence generation, some cross-boundary layer transport, sediment transport, and all that kind of good stuff. I'm going to get back to a figure from this paper later. So some takeaways, right? So the coastal ocean has a consistent waveguide for internal waves. I think that's a fairly there's no controversy in that statement. Internal waves can have a substantial amplitude, more than 10% of the water depth, and maybe up to 35% in extreme cases, and typically have a larger horizontal extent than their vertical scale. They seem to have generic non-sinusoidal shape, right? So they're not plane waves of theory. And internal waves induce velocities throughout the water column, not just at the waveguide. They can provide disturbances in and transport across the bottom boundary layer, and that's kind of been an on and off again topic of interest for me throughout my career. Internal waves don't just happen in the ocean, they also happen in the atmosphere. So here's some beautiful pictures from Australia. This is the Gulf of Carpentaria in the north of Australia. If you have good eyes, you can see Darwin on the map, and then Cairns, where the Great Barrier Reef is over here. And a picture on the bottom from space shows you this long, incredible cloud. And basically this cloud is a manifestation of invisible, large-scale internal waves. And there's actually people who go hang glide and use these things as a playland. So, you know, the picture on the top left kind of blows my mind, and I love to show it. So we'll stick to the ocean for the rest of the time, but a lot of these ideas that I'm going to show you do also apply to the atmospheric context. Okay, so, you know, something I've done a lot on over the years, and certainly, you know, there's lots to say. So what to say about the theoretical description of internal waves? So first of all, right, these are the stratified Navier-Stokes. I'm making it easy on myself. I'm not worried about the equation of state in this case. I've color-coded the various terms. So the purple terms are advection terms. Green terms are kind of this weird business, that incompressibility, right? So we filtered out sound for all you acoustics people. Just the timescales for sound are just too small for us to worry about. And somehow those green terms have to conspire to allow us to move things forward in numerical models, and that's really the challenge of these systems. The buoyancy terms are in orange, and then the irreversible terms are in these sort of salmon colors. So if you drop the terms in the salmon boxes, you get the stratified Euler equations, which are inviscid. Okay, and in fact, those are the fundamental toolbox for describing internal solitary waves, because if you include dissipation, right, you're always drawing energy out, and then therefore you cannot be solitary. Okay, so this is a very old picture I like to show. I like to remind myself that even when I was a PhD student, it was quite possible to simulate certain things. So this is kind of what I do in the lab now all the time, right? Except that it's flipped. So in the upper panel, I've got water that's 100 meters deep. I'm only showing you the bottom 60 meters. For reasons I don't recall, I made the stratification near the bottom, probably so that it kind of looks like surface waves. And I do what's called a lock release by experimentalists, right? So I deform the pycnocline. In this model, I do it smoothly, but in an experiment, you would do it with a barrier. And basically, if you're doing this in a lab at zero, you would have the edge of your tank, right? So I'm kind of letting things go to the right and to the left because it's easier numerically. In a lab, it's easier to just have stuff go to the right. So you release the barrier, and for a while, something messy happens, and then out of that mess, out comes this kind of beautiful bell shape. If you let it go a little further, out comes a second, smaller, wider bell shape, and then a bunch of noise left behind. Okay, so basically, the reason for all the theory is that these sorts of objects, right, these bell-shaped objects are observed all the time, right? I think one of the things being trained as I started out as a pure mathematician many years ago, and then just kind of turned my back on that stuff is because it seemed to have no interaction with anything real. And it still happens in the mathematical literature that sometimes people just get kind of excited about the equations and forget that the main reason is that these waves are actually observable, right? So you can do this experiment in a tank of your choice as long as it's long enough. And we can talk about that if anyone's interested afterwards. Okay, so the basic waveguide I mentioned, just so you have it concretely in your head, right? You take the density, you write it as scaling, basically something that has all the dimensions. So think of rho naught as being 1027 kilograms per meters cubed if you want. And then two parts, right? Some kind of semi-permanent background state, rho bar of Z, and then a perturbation, which is the way linear theory of waves would be derived. If you want a concrete example of rho bar of Z, It's given in the middle of the slide, right? So it's a smooth hyperbolic tangent profile. And basically what you get is schematized on the left. You have less dense epicnocline of thickness roughly around D, right? Over which there's a fairly rapid change, and then a more dense fluid underneath, okay? And if you left the fluid alone, if it wasn't moving at all, right? It would just sit there like that, right? So you would call that state hydrostatic balance, right? The pressure balances this density profile, and there's no motion. So theoretical treatment of waves in a stratified fluid linearizes the governing equations. And in fact, most often it introduces a stream function from the grad dot u equals 0 condition as it goes along. And then it does not assume that the motion is hydrostatic, even though we do that quite often for large-scale oceanography. And then it assumes the solution is a plane wave, right? And it wants to solve for some kind of structure function, which we're going to label phi eventually, and the phase speed, right? So remember, the phase speed and the group speed are different things. And the interesting things about this is that from a mathematician's point of view is, right, you usually think of waves as solutions to the wave equation. And that turns out to be an example of a hyperbolic PDE, and this is not a hyperbolic PDE, right? So in fact, in the world of physics, most real waves, right, electromagnetism in a vacuum and, I don't know, small sound to some extent are the two exceptions, are hyperbolic systems, but most waves are not, okay? And so for most waves, energy in phase does not propagate with the same speed, but I caution everybody that there's never been a proper nonlinear theory developed for that. So sometimes you see this in papers, and when I get them to review, I always complain that you shouldn't use linear concepts to describe finite amplitude waves. Okay, so here it is in equations. I don't want to go over too many equations, but just a reminder, right? So n squared is the buoyancy frequency squared, or the Bernd-Weisshaus frequency squared. It's defined as being proportional to the derivative, right, or the rate of change with height of the density profile. And then the G and the rho naught just kind of make sure everything works dimensionally. If you do all the algebra, the equation you actually get for the stream function is that weird one in the middle, right? And I say weird because the time derivatives are operating on something that's already had spatial derivatives taken care of it. And then I think the only part that I really care to sort of spend time on is this thing called a wave ansatz, right? So we make what's called the traveling wave ansatz or plane wave ansatz. So we say, and we use complex notation just because it's easier to do the algebra, that the stream function is e to the I kx minus sigma t times some structure function phi. We do a bunch of algebra and we get an eigenvalue problem for phi, okay? So the idea is you tell me the wave number and I solve for you phi, and the phase speed c is a function of k, okay? And if you take the limit k goes to 0, though the limit of very long waves, you would get what would be called the linear long wave speed, okay? C underscore LW. So here's some pictures of solutions of the system, right? So what you end up getting are modes, basically the number of times that phi crosses 0, right? So mode 1 only reaches 0 at the top and bottom and never crosses it. Mode 2 crosses it once. Mode 3 crosses it 3 times, okay? And so what you see is that as mode number increases, waves get slower, and as k increases, so as waves get shorter, waves are slower. And one super interesting thing is that if you look at the longest mode 2 waves, right, so the red curve, they match the phase speed of short mode 1 waves. So one of the things that I'm going to talk about is for nonlinear waves is that mode 1 waves are exceptional, okay? And in fact, when you go to the coastal ocean, for many, many years, mode 1 waves were the whole show. There's been an uptick of interest in mode 2 waves because those have been observed, including some really cool ones off New Jersey. But really historically, mode 1 and energetically, mode 1 is kind of the whole show. Okay, and here's the vertical structure, not too much to say there. Okay, so never ever have those waves been observed. Almost all waves have some departure from that idealization. Something that's much closer to what has been observed is the picture over here. So this is an example of a fully nonlinear or exact solitary wave, okay? I prefer the acronym ISW for internal solitary-like wave. Sometimes in literature use this acronym NLIW, which my PhD advisor thought illogical. because there's no such thing as linear waves. Linear waves are abstractions, they're mathematical abstractions, and any finite amplitude wave, if you wait long enough, in fact, will show nonlinear characteristics. Okay, so, well, little peccadillos about acronyms aside, what are you looking at? So there's a couple of different ways to look at it, right? So I'm coloring in the density field for you. I have a slightly more realistic stratification here than the one I showed before. I have a mixed layer, which is the dark blue. I have a pycnocline, which is kind of the rainbow of colors in the middle. And then I have a really slow, basically linear stratification underneath, right? So something that's a lot like the coastal ocean, 100 meters deep, right? And the wave is about 20 meters tall. So it's a sizable wave. It has this bell shape, right? It's propagating left to right, as indicated by the arrow on top. And it has wave-induced currents sort of throughout the water column, right? All things I said, now kind of borne out by some mathematics. But you can also look at it and think about it saying, yeah, Mark, like don't think of it as a wave at all, right? Think of it as a baroclinic vortex, right? So one of the things that's maybe a little underappreciated out there is the extent to which internal solitary waves are a source of vorticity. Okay, so a little bit of math. One interesting thing that's useful is you can imagine taking a little ride along one of the sort of bands of same color. So just fix your eye on the yellow one, maybe, right? And you could say, well, I start at some point xz at the wave crest. Where do I end up when I go far ahead of the wave? So you end up somewhere distant in x, but you end up at a well-defined height z minus eta, where eta is called the isopycnal displacement. And the isopycnal displacement ends up being very useful for the description of these waves. And it's useful for the description of these waves because way back in the early 20th century, a French scientist named Dubreuil-Chacotin, that's her picture at the bottom right, came up with an equation that governs such motions, okay? And it's very innocuous looking. It looks like something, the first part of it looks very friendly, right? It looks like it's the Laplacian of eta, and Laplace's equation is possibly the most studied mathematical object out there. But then it takes a bit of a departure, right? It takes the buoyancy frequency, divides it by c squared, and multiplies by eta, which seems fine, and it looks a lot like the linear eigenvalue problem, except it says, you should not be evaluating the buoyancy frequency at z, you should be evaluating it at the upstream height. So if you go back to here, you should be evaluating your buoyancy frequency up here. So that's what mathematicians would call a strong nonlinearity, and probably was one of the reasons why this was ignored for so many years. This equation actually was quite a big part of work in the atmospheric community, and that's largely due to an experimentalist named Long in the 50s, who looked at many cases of it with n squared constant. So if you have a linear stratification, which the atmosphere people do think of quite often, then n squared of z minus eta is just a constant. So all the nonlinearity goes away. But in the ocean, where we typically have a pycnocline, the nonlinearity doesn't go away. So the equation was rediscovered in the early 90s by a group working out of UMass, Bruce Turkington's group. They did some really scary math. They made the equation a lot uglier. They turned it into an optimization problem. And I was given the task of adding background shear to it during my PhD thesis. So I spent a lot of fairly miserable hours sorting out their math and learning a bunch of optimization theory. And in the end, wrote kind of some clumsy C code to do it. And when I got my position at Waterloo, I was teaching numerical PDs, and I gave it as a problem just for fun for a project. And a student named Mike Dunphy wrote a beautiful MATLAB code that we published in NPG that solves this equation for stratifications of your choice. And it does so in most cases under a minute on your laptop. So the point is that you could have this, and probably a nicer version than mine if you're good at making graphics, in a really short amount of time. So you don't need to go back to linear theory. So historically, internal solitaries have mostly been described by other theories. Those go back to David Benny, working at MIT in the late 60s. He basically rediscovered effectively the Korteweg-de Vries equation, which went back to 1895. And the idea is that for stratified fluid, the coefficients of the KdV equations depend on your stratification and your background velocity. So a lot of math on this slide, and I don't love these theories, but they do dominate chunks of the literature. So I'll just kind of show it to you. So maybe just focus on on the definition of the stream function. So basically you assume that the stream function is separable, right? So that you can write the horizontal and time dependence times the vertical dependence. That's not a great idea, it turns out, but it's a place to start. And when you do that, after a lot of relatively painful algebra, you get what's called the Korteweg-de equation, which is an advection equation modified by two terms, one of which is yellow and one of which is pink on my slide here. So the nonlinear one is yellow, and that's the one that would steepen your waves. And the pink one is dispersive, and that's the one that would broaden your waves. So this is kind of like the simplest physics model of a competition for nonlinear waves. And so therefore you can have this beautiful balance between your nonlinear steepening and your dispersive broadening, and you get waves of permanent form or solitary waves. Turns out these can actually be written down in closed form, and all that good stuff. And then the vertical structure functions given by the eigenvalue problem at the bottom, which is just an algebraically more complex version of what I showed you before. So this is all good, but the only problem with it, it has no sense of when it fails, right? So it's like saying that 300 is an approximation of pi, right? So in any reasonable world, right, you would say, well, 3 is a better approximation of pi, right? Because you would actually be in your mind measuring the distance between 3.14159.265 and so on, and 3 and 300. But the KDV doesn't do that. So people consistently use this equation in the literature, and they will claim things that it describes certain parts of what's observed, but typically it'll only describe aspects of the horizontal structure, and the vertical structure is usually dead wrong. And those observations go back to, I don't know, late 90s, early 2000s. So people love the KDV equation, and they should, because it's one of these examples of what's called a soliton equation. So even though it's a nonlinear equation, its solutions behave kind of in a predictable way. So they behave effectively like billiard balls. The only interaction between a big wave, the red one here, and the light blue one, is that when they interact, there's a bit of a phase shift, but at the end, the amplitudes are preserved, which is sort of amazing by that the nature allows this sort of stuff to happen. So, you know, I totally understand why the 70s were completely occupied with exploring this theory to its fullest. So so you can solve the KDV if you want code for it in MATLAB. You know, you can find all sorts of them. If you can't, drop me a line and I'll send you mine. But fitting the KDV theory to measurements or simulations is problematic. And there's been lots of talk about that, but it hasn't been published all that much. So Lam and Yan, JPO 1996 is the reference I quite often use. It hasn't stopped anyone. The mathematical communities continue to use this. And in fact, there's an extension they like called the MKDV or Gardner equation, which is written at the bottom of the slide for you. But in a number of footnotes in various papers, it's been shown that the MKDV doesn't really get you quantitative information. It gives you qualitative info about certain kinds of internal waves, but you're going to make big mistakes if you use it to predict vertical structure. Okay, so I think this is just a summary slide about sort of why I prefer the DJL description. So basically, the DJL gives you a way to initialize solitary waves in numerical models, because you can use the solver to get eta, and from eta you get the stream function. From the stream function you get your velocities, and then you can even get pressure if your model needs it. Most models don't need it. Okay, and also the DJL description allows us to answer all sorts of interesting theoretical questions. So here's a fun one, right? So you could ask yourself, what sets the upper bound on internal wave amplitude? So it turns out there's 3 ways that you can sort of control the upper bound. Though the one that's most like surface waves is called breaking or core formation. I won't talk about that today, but if somebody wants to talk about it, I'm happy to do so offline. The one I'm showing you here is called wave broadening, or the tabletop wave, or the conjugate flow. The conjugate flow idea goes back to the late 60s, 67, I think, work by Brooke Benjamin at one of the Cambridge or Oxford or one of those places. And what you basically see is waves that have a flat crest. So if you give this wave more energy, it doesn't get taller, it just extends out. So in the picture on the left, I have a theoretical one, and you look at it and you go, yeah, these mathematicians are fools. But if you look at the picture on the right, which I extracted from that Lam and Warren Barnett paper, and you flip my wave upside down, you certainly get a resemblance to those tabletop waves that naturally fission out of that little wave as it shoals. And there have been similar measurements by Greg Ivy's group on the Northwest Australian shelf. So even the sort of esoteric mathematical stuff seems to pop up in unusual places in the field. So takeaways. The theory of internal waves has a clear cost in terms of time put in for a mathematical description. But the good news is that's already been done, okay? Historically, the linear description came first, but this was largely driven by an inability to compute as opposed to actual accuracy, right? When you can't do anything, you should do the simplest thing. It's kind of an interpretation of Occam's razor. So modern descriptions, such as the DJL equation, often have code available and add concreteness to the theoretical calculations. So I don't think it's reasonable to expect coastal oceanographers to dig up Bruce Turkington's papers on optimization theory, but I think it is quite reasonable to download Mike Dunphy's code and kind of run it in MATLAB or Python or whatever version you favor. The DJL equation is hands down the best description of internal solitary waves because it doesn't make any approximations. It's equivalent to the full stratified Euler equations. The best means best mathematically and practically because you can initialize really well with it for models, okay? And then internal solitary waves are the archetype of coherent, long-lived non-hydrostatic motion, right? So some food for thought. I like to show this picture. So on the left, I've got kind of a canonical picture of a turbulent cascade. And when I was a youngster, one of the things that attracted me about fluids was sort of this tyranny of nonlinearity, right? I mean, almost. You take quantum mechanics as kind of a young physicist, and then you take fluid mechanics, and everything in quantum mechanics, as cool as it was linear, and everything in fluid mechanics was nonlinear. And somehow, the two paths and all the rest of that, I end up choosing the nonlinear one, and I've never stopped being interested in this, right? So you read, I guess English translations of the Kolmogorov papers and stuff like that, and there's this miraculous way of thinking about it based on dimensional analysis that basically says, look, you inject energy at some scale, so 1/L in that picture on the right, and by a completely inviscid process, right, by a process that does not dissipate energy, right, you cascade that energy into smaller and smaller scales, and then you extract it through viscous dissipation, right? So that's Kolmogorov's. It's Richardson's cascade, a la Kolmogorov, 1941. But internal solitary waves and a coastal ocean actually gives you a completely different interpretation of nonlinearity, right? It says, well, it's probably true that everything is turbulent, but that turbulence is not efficient at moving energy away because we have things like this wave able to propagate across the whole South China Sea, right? Okay, so they can propagate hundreds of kilometers without fundamentally changing form. And they are only possible because of nonlinearity. So it can't be true that the only thing nonlinearity does is cause disorder. And I think that's some good food for thought. Okay, so I want to talk about something a little more concrete. Let me see how much time there is. Yeah, maybe we can get through this. I'm going to talk about direct numerical simulation, another one of my loves, right? Trying to get a bigger computer to do things that are a little more accurate. And the context I'm going to take is a lab scale Kelvin wave. So you may recall from your GFD course that Kelvin waves are waves that are only possible due to rotation and only possible when you have a coast. So the analogy that's often given is a drunk stumbling home on Saturday night, leaning against the wall as they go. Okay. So here's an example. I talked about experiments. So in our lab, actually our tank isn't long enough to really do mode 1 very well, but because mode 2 waves are slower, we're quite good at doing mode 2 waves. So here's a picture of a simulation of a mode 2 wave. What I mean by mode 2 wave is that the upper part of the picnic line is displaced upwards and the lower one's displaced downwards. This was work by David Deepwell when he was a PhD student. And we have rotation in this case, right? So the wave decays slowly away from the coast, okay? And the Kelvin waves from GFD class did so exponentially, and they had really no spatial structure to it. And this finite amplitude manifestation kind of has a curve to the wave as it goes across the tank. The tank has a finite extent, which of course the theory is semi-infinite, at least the way I was taught it out of Gill. And then you see a whole bunch of other stuff, right? You see these beautiful billows at the edges of the wave, right? They roll up and then they kind of descend into chaos of stratified turbulence at the back, right? So the idea is what we were doing in David's thesis is we started with well-ordered waves. We did some experiments with our colleagues at Dundee at the time. And then we wanted to kind of make it more disordered. We wanted a situation where waves coexisted with turbulence. And of course, those of you who work in the field, this happens all the time. But for theorists, this is still a challenge. So to date, I think this is the biggest simulations I've ever done. It's on the order of 8,000 by, I think, 512 by 1,000, if I remember right. It might be on here. Oh no, 512 by 512. Okay, so here's a schematic. Again, we can talk in detail later if you want. Okay, I think I already said all this stuff. So incidentally, my esteemed colleague Magda Carr, who's an amazing source of experimental information's moved. She was at St. Andrews, well, the tank was at Dundee for reasons I don't quite understand, but she's since moved to Newcastle, and they have some really interesting experimental work coming out basically all the time. So here's some pictures for kind of the detailed anatomy of what's going on, right? So you've got this beautiful kind of intrusion or this mode 2 wave at the top. You're seeing it from the side, so it's like you're standing beside the aquarium looking at the fish, right? And then I put a slice through, right? So, you know, imagine you got your laser in your lab shining things through, and then I'm going to take a look at the structure. And what you see in these places is an interleaving structure, okay? It's really quite amazing. So as these things that look very much like traditional KH billows, they do not behave like KH billows at all, right? They produce local unstable stratifications, which are probably best seen in panel, well, maybe panel C is the clearest because there's the least going on. You see this blue in between white, right? So that can't persist, right? So this instability that you see in the upper part will also drive smaller scale secondary instabilities. And if you go back to that Kolmogorov picture, it means that this doesn't happen at all, right? Somehow you're taking jumps and leaps over your length scales, and it's not that the big whorls eat the yield little whorls, and that nursery rhyme that Richardson came up with. Okay, so I mean the main point, there's a lot in this slide. There's a lot of wave theory that comes down to this, but I guess the main point is that we published this in NPG in 2018, and you can dig into details there. So what I really want to talk about is what we did with it afterwards, right? So one of the things with giant 3D data sets is the stuff you can do. And one branch of things you can do is graphics. So this is work on looking at different points of view, right? So these are isosurfaces of the entropy field, right? Which is the rotational equivalent of kinetic energy, and shown at 3 different times as this sort of mode 2 wave evolves. And what you see are isolated coherent vortices, right? So very clearly in this sort of transition to stratified turbulence, you have coherent structures, and coherent structures are a huge sort of last part of the 20th century and current interest in turbulence, right? Typically in things like boundary layers or shear layers, but here they seem to spontaneously appear as part of kind of the complex wave structure. Okay, so I went back and got quite interested in the anatomy of the turbulent breakdown, budgets and all the rest of it. And I talked about that at APS a few years ago, and I don't really have time to look at it today. But in terms of the graphics, one of the things with 3D is it's a real challenge. I'm not a terribly artistically minded person. I have an appreciation for graphics and art, but I don't see it. And so I'm always amazed at how something, it's like the parable about the elephant, right? I mean, these are 3 different views of the same things, but they tell you very different stuff, right? So the front view tells me not very much of stuff at all. This is the wave coming at you, and you see some turbulency type stuff kind of away from the wall. The side view gives you a very traditional view, basically because I've done these experiments so many times that I've seen this in the lab over and over again. It's the top view at the bottom that actually is the most instructive to me, which is the one that you get these sort of patches, like these coherent vortices that get ejected from this mess, so that actually stay coherent well away from the transition zone. Okay, and here it is kind of at the best angle where you see all of it. It's great to have, David was really good at graphics. It's great to have grad students who are into this stuff, because this is ParaView, and it does not play nice. So I think for those of us who are more on the senior end of the spectrum, it's okay to be worried about this stuff, because I simply don't have time to do a lot of it myself, but I do like sitting with the students and rotating it and playing with it. And it is, in some ways, this is as much of a computational challenge as the actual runs themselves these days. Okay, so here's some some viscous dissipation. You can kind of see that it happens where you think it might, right, along the shear regions. And then here's one of those, Q and R, right, one of the things that supposedly tracks coherent coherent vortices, and you can see, yeah, sure enough, it caught some of those vortices that are coming out the back. Okay, so I'll skip this stuff and get to the takeaways. So our code is pseudospectral MPI parallelized, right, which for direct numerical simulations allows you to resolve everything. What that means in practice is that you're consigned, if you're going to resolve everything, to experimental scales, which is okay because we have a nice relationship with a bunch of experimentalists. But the scale up to field scales needs really careful argument and truth be told, some humility, right? So you need, when you do numerics, you need to be able to sort of say, hey, I'm going to do something new, but then afterwards you need to say, okay, let's cool our jets a little bit and let's consider that we may not be getting everything, because out in the real world, right, the disparity between a wave that might have length scales of 100 meters, right, propagating over tens of kilometers, seeing all sorts of changes in the stratification and the bottom bathymetry and all the rest of it, there'll be things you're missing, okay? I think a lot of times when you read the literature, you should have a healthy skepticism for what's going on. I would say most papers, including mine, under-resolve something or another, and some do it quite brutally, right? So if you're using something like the MIT GCM and you're doing sort of field scale things, you should think about the numerical dissipation in your code, okay? And then, yeah, the last point I think I've already covered. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is the boundary layer. I sort of teased it at the start. So again, kind of this theme of coherent structures. So up at the top, I have a very traditional engineering picture. At the bottom, I think this is Klein's picture, if I remember right. It's a smoke wire picture. The flow is from left to right, and the wire generates smoke or bubbles. If it's water, it's a electric wire making little hydrogen bubbles. If it's air, then it's smoke. Both give you the same thing. And you see these sort of streaks, right? These interactions, these streaks that stay quite coherent, and then eventually sort of pair up and break down into turbulence. So here's some historical pictures. I don't dress this nicely for my lab, but there's Prontal in the lab. And the thing that I always found fascinating about boundary layers is all the exotic stuff that happens. So I was a basketball player growing up, so of course I'm fascinated with things that a ball does and the separation from it, which you see at the bottom right. But then as you kind of get into the more, I guess, physics or math realm, I've been fascinated with turbulent spots because they're in some sense an analogy of what we see in the ocean, right? They're a bit of disorder in a sea of order, whereas these internal waves are a bit of order in a sea of disorder. Okay, so here's this one again. So I've worked on this a long time. Leon Bogman and I have a review on all the things that are possible in the annual review of fluid mechanics. And for those of you who know about ARFM, you know that they have an in-house artist. So I take no credit. I sent truly terrible versions of these things that I drew. And then the in-house artist produced these beautiful diagrams for all the ways, at least up to that time, that we knew about internal waves driving boundary layer instabilities. So if you care about that kind of thing, maybe look it up and grab those diagrams. They're really, the person did such an awesome job. I love to advertise other people's good work. So the central challenge numerically is resolving the wave body and the thin boundary layer. I'll remind you again, I would love to do this at some point. I think we're getting close to the point where we can do something like these relatively shallow water things in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, but not quite there yet. So one thing that's really interesting is maybe look at, well, there's a couple different panels here. So this is from Clark Richards' work in that same location in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And basically what you see are associated with these waves as they shoal are these kind of what are called turbulent boluses. Okay, and you see a bunch of them in panel E over here. Maybe the first two are the clearest. Okay, and the thing that you typically get is people have done these, going back to Helfrich and other people in the 80s that experienced Wallace. There was another one. You do these experiments, but you typically do them with much sharper slopes, right? So it's hard to get a tank that's 50 meters long. They have one in Oslo, but that's the only place I can think of where you have an internal wave tank that's that long. So out in the field, right, Richards reports the slope of 0.033. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to do something like that. Okay, so Will Zhu, who was another great student, same vintage as David Deepwell, did some of these experiments sort of late in his PhD. So we did a 20-meter tank that was a half meter deep, and the slope was 0.02. So it was even more gentle than what Richards and Bourgault measured in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Okay, so this is some technical stuff. And so basically what we want to do is we have one of these waves going along, and it's transitioning as it gets into the shallows, but it's doing so in a very gentle way, right? So just like those Lamb and Warren-Varness pictures I showed you at the start from the South China Sea, this is my best offer of something that does something like that with an active bottom boundary layer. So I want you to focus on that part, and here I'm showing you the wave-induced, the horizontal velocity component, and you can see this part over here, this part over here. You have this intensification and separation near the bottom, and you get this bubble forming over here, and then the bubble seems to induce some turbulence in the stratification. Here's the vorticity picture of that. Again, Will was a bit of an artist with his color schemes, and you can see, right, basically some vorticity generated here gets ejected. It rolls up the picnic line and kind of destroys it, and then propagates downstream. And this thing over here stays persistent as the wave shoals. Okay, and here's some Hubble plots if you like that kind of thing, showing you the space-time evolution. So what my main point is, I think I'm nearing the end here, is we're getting there, right? It's still not field scale, and it's probably not going to be, if you care about the South China Sea, which starts out 3 kilometers deep, we're not going to be able to resolve the boundary layer. But we're getting closer and closer all the time, and it's kind of a noble effort to do these multi-scale simulations, right? And when you do them, you start to ask yourself questions like, well, this is kind of amazing, right? If I imagine doing this with a tank that was 5 meters deep, right? Would I still, right? So here I'm going maybe 1/10 of the tank going up, okay? Right? And if it's 1/10 of the tank going up with a 5 meter length, that would be a 50 centimeter vortex, right? So, does that really happen? Probably not in the field, right? You don't have giant vortices. Somebody would have measured them by now, right? So there have to be these interesting ways in which the field scale boundary layers break down that the experimental ones might not. Okay, and so there's a lot of room for some exploration. So though Pete Imesi's group has a particular take on how this stuff happens, they use a very different type of model than I do, and I go down to Cornell and hang out with Pete quite a bit. And so it's kind of an ongoing conversation for all these things. One thing that it's not, for those of you who are sort of classically trained in hydraulics, it's not the Shields criteria, right? You can't just assume that you need powerful enough shear, right? There's some interplay between what happens. So if you think about this picture, right, here's this wave of depression, but it's transitioning at the back, right? So you have these sort of flow in this direction over here, and then this wave at the back is getting bigger, so you have a counterflow, and it's underneath that part that you have the separation bubble forming and the boundary layer breaking down. So the takeaway again is that these pseudospectral MPI parallelized codes allow us to resolve almost everything for the experimental scale, and even a bit beyond experimental scales. I'm not aware of anyone who's got a 20-meter tank looking to do this stuff. I would be really excited if somebody was. Simulations allow us to access variables that are difficult to measure cleanly in a physical experiment. So, from talking to Magda, that boundary layer is a tough. Magda's done some stuff in the boundary layer, but it's not so easy. Okay, and then true DNS, right? So where you would give this a substantial number of three-dimensional points, they're still a bit borderline. So Oliver Fringer at Stanford's done a whole bunch of work on this. He's got this practical definition of what DNS is. I guess I'm a little more conservative than that, and occasionally Oliver and I go out for drinks at conferences and argue about this stuff. But we can do it. It's just that it requires careful interpretation, and we're still not at the point where something like those charisma measurements I showed you really have an easy interpretation. Okay, so some concluding thoughts. There are many existing mathematical descriptions of internal waves, have the off-the-shelf software available, right? Perhaps more than people think. So for whatever reason, I seek to review papers that want to, use very complicated expressions from weakly nonlinear theory, but they don't want to take 2 minutes to calculate fully nonlinear waves. I'm not really sure I understand why that is, if the tools are available open source. Similarly, I think there are enough publicly available CFD models that allow for higher resolution modeling of internal wave processes. And I think it's really important that, there's amazing field experiments, right? So Jack mentioned we met the Gordon conference, and one of the things she was involved with afterwards were these mammoth, many people, millions of dollars worth of equipment experiments off Point Sal in California. Those boggle my mind, right, in terms of complexity and what they deliver. But at the same time, I think we need to push the process studies forward a little bit. And I think in some sense, we've lost a bit of that communication. There seems to be this mistrust in the physical oceanographic community between, what simulations are supposed to tell you. And I wish there was more of an ongoing dialogue. And I think I'm going to leave it there. I do have some stuff about rotation, but we'll just leave it alone for now. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. So we'll go ahead and open the floor to questions. Feel free to, you can either raise your hand or unmute yourself or put them in the chat for folks on the call here.
I can stop the share so I can see the chat.
Oh, there we go. Just get the chat ready. All right. So maybe I'll kick things off. I have a million questions, but starting sort of large scale here, thinking you talked about this collaboration between process studies and field studies, and when I see some of these numerical modeling results, I think about the spatial variability, right? If you have a single mooring out and you observe one piece of this, how to interpret it, I sort of see it in an analogy to how to visualize, right? The challenge of visualization. Do you have any ideas, concrete ideas about how, you talked a lot about how observations are informing the modeling studies, but sort of flipping that, taking what you guys are learning from the modeling, and maybe what as observationalists we should be thinking about in terms of how to design these campaigns.
So one thing, I think it's always good to ask colleagues for things. So one thing I've done with the Cornell group, with Pete's group, I've made fake data basically for them, right? So I would do a simulation of something. I'd say, okay, I'm going to create, my own thermistor chain, right? And I'm gonna record. I'm gonna have a completely fictitious rate of recording, and I'm gonna produce Humboldt plots of that. And then when I go down to Cornell and we talk to the field guys, right, in the group, so Todd and other people, they have a better time with that, right? Because I tend to think of things as numerical people tend to think of snapshots, right? Because you stored your data at a particular time, whereas field people prefer, continuously gathered data, but in a transect or something like that. And I think, especially with data science tools, you can do this now, right? It's actually been, it's been a decade. So one of my early mentors told me that, I think we've passed the point. He was a stratified turbulence guy, and he said, I think we've passed the point where the doing the numerical model is the primary task. You do the numerical model, but it's all the post-processing afterwards that's the more significant task. So having somebody run a giant 3D simulation saying, look, now I want you to make me fake moorings, or I want you to, or even better, at the conception stage, put something in the code that gives you, moorings more often than you're saving all the fields. That would be my primary thing. And then, discussions about gaps, right? So I reviewed a really interesting paper in JPO where they tried to use a version of ROMs to look at shoaling. And it was really clear the boundary layer is wrong, right? And so I wrote this really careful review because I said, look, I know you're trying, right? But I think, as colleagues, we should be able to say that sort of random straight line, isopycnals are wrong, and that it's completely due to this numerical scheme that's inherent in the model. And I'm not blaming you for using it, right? I think the onus is on theorists to be more tolerant of that kind of stuff, but also to say, okay, well, we're doing the best we can with the tool we have. So I guess I like most things, I think it comes down to communication, and probably communication at the conceptualization stage, right? And I think actually NSF is way better than our Canadian funding agencies at that, right? Because there's this much stronger insistence on having multiple points of view, right? So experimentalists and theorists. Here we can still kind of do lone wolf stuff where it's just somebody in a room. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting aspect of the discussion here. I see a hand up from Bob. Bob, do you want to chime in?
Yes, that was really informative, and I can't claim to understand a great deal of what you mentioned in any kind of detail, but I'm wondering in particular about the bottom boundary layer, which you showed in a number of cases. You showed it in your solitary wave simulation, and there were vectors going into the seabed that wasn't clear exactly what controlled the magnitude of those. And I'm particularly interested in the difference of impacts of the waves on and the impact of the boundary on the waves in the cases where you had fluid muds, such as you get in a deltaic system, a typical deltaic system, or permeable boundaries like you get in sandy shelf regions. And can you contrast some of
Yeah,
those?
sure. I mean, it's a super interesting topic. So I mean, mud is really hard, right? It's rheologically complicated. I'm not really sure there's been anything done, right, on sort of really doing that right, because so for me, a boundary layer is no slip boundary conditions, right? But if you've got a liquefied mud layer, that's not the case at all, right? So I've thought about it, I've played with it. I've never published anything on it because I had no confidence in what I've done. There's somebody in Holland, Winterwerp, is it? I think that does stuff like that. So they were expanding their cruise ship terminal, and they were finding, because these cruise ships are so big, they were actually exciting waves in the mud layer. So I think that it was motivated by money from the dredging industry, but I'm not really sure if there's a simple takeaway. Where I think there is a relatively simple takeaway is in the porous one, right? Because at least for a start with porous materials, you can kind of say, porous theory in the sand, and then kind of a wave in the fluid, right? So there's literature about what you should be doing about like the Beavers and Joseph condition, right? Going back to the late 60s at the bottom. But it turns out that because there's such a disparity in terms of how strong the motion is in the fluid, whereas how slow it is in the porous medium, you can kind of do a one-way coupled model. So many years ago, Jay Olshorn and I, who's at Queens now, had a paper in Water Resources Research about that. But I think the interesting thing that we only had a conceptual model for, didn't have a full numerical for, is what if you have a porous medium, right? That's a little bit dirty, and then now you have turbulence, right? So you imagine you could pick up some stuff, it goes along, and now it plugs up the pores somewhere else. So we were thinking about lakes at the time, but I guess for sandy deltas, that could be the case. So I guess I would say it depends on how brave models. Models are driven by economics, like everything else, right? So I'm not really aware of a good model that'll do complicated rheology for the bottom. So for mud, you'd probably have to dedicate a student to write it from scratch.
Thank you.
Malcolm?
Oh, hi, Marek. Thanks for a brilliant talk. Couple of maybe simple questions. The last numerical simulation you did, where you had the instability growing at the bottom under the soliton, is that connected to the bottom? What's the bottom boundary layer, or is it just an visit?
Oh no, it's no slip. That was like a full Navier-Stokes simulation.
Yeah. And another question: when you look at, say, satellite observations of internal tides propagating across the shelf, the group has typically 3 or 4, maybe 5 waves in the group. And I'm wondering what determines that. You never see one where there's 20 waves, and maybe often you don't even see one where there's a single wave.
So I mean, theory says, right, if you go back to the KdV equation, that there's these predictions for, if you have a box of a certain size, here's the number of soltons that come out of it. I suspect that in the field, that's part of the answer, right? Because your internal, you have to generate those waves somehow. But I think there's a little more to it than that. So, you know, that night inlet in the picture I showed, I did simulations of that years and years ago when I was a postdoc. And one of the things I found was that, just like you said, there's a number of waves that form, and then somehow some sort of, you know, non-traditional instability builds up, and then it gets noisy, right? It breaks down on its own. So I would suspect some of the waves further back just kind of break down earlier than you actually see them. So part of it will be the length scales associated with the formation, and then part of it probably will be some kind of breakdown. But it's a great question. I mean, I've thought about thinking about more than one wave is probably the biggest direction. It's hard to write in a grant, but you know, when so many of these things we've done, right? It's like the solitary horseman riding over the hill, right? And then another solitary horseman, and soon there's a crowd of them. But in fact, all the satellite pictures are always more than one wave, right?
Yeah. Or is it maybe it takes a certain amplitude of the tidal current to trigger them off, like a spring tide or something, or near the crest
for sure.
of the incoming current across a steep shelf break?
Well, correct. Yeah. I mean, part of why Night Inlet was of such interest is because of the large amplitude still, right? You get faster currents, so you're more likely to reach supercriticality at some point during the tidal cycle, and then you generate these big waves. So
yeah, thank you.
All right, so we are over our hour. So if anybody has any interest in continuing the conversation, let me know. We can schedule a follow-up conversation with Marek. But in the meantime, thank you so much for speaking today. This was really, really a great seminar. And
So,
yeah.
Jack, is this recorded? I missed the first 5 minutes.
Yeah, it is recorded, and Mark will go ahead and distribute that later today.
Thank you.
Yep, thanks.
Thank you again.
I just want to say, well, thanks, first of all. It's really cool. But you know, if anybody thinks of anything, I'm a notoriously slow thinker. So if you're like me and you're walking home or you're walking your dog tonight, and you think of something, you know, drop me a line, and I know, yeah, I'm happy to chat over Zoom, and you know, maybe see each other at a conference or something like that. So